Hello, Pack. Tonight begins with a rejection. Not a quiet one, not the kind that happens in private, where at least the wound is yours alone. This one happened in front of witnesses, in front of torches, in front of a pack that had already started to bow. She didn't know she was pregnant yet. She found out 3 hours later, alone in a room that still smelled like him. By morning, she was gone. He would spend 6 years trying to understand what he'd thrown away. He wouldn't fully succeed until he was standing in front of a boy with his own gray eyes, looking up at him with the particular patience of a child who had been raised by a woman who never panicked. Let's begin. She had been Mira Voss for 24 years before she became something the Ironhold pack couldn't categorize. She arrived at the Ironhold on a Tuesday in late autumn, carrying a satchel of healer's tools and a letter of introduction from the Northern Guild. She had been sent to assist with a fever that had been moving through the pack's younger members, a strain that the resident healers couldn't fully break. It was work. It was a contract. It was supposed to be 3 weeks, and then she would go home to the small guild house in Ashfield, where she kept her things and her routines and her careful, manageable life. The gate guards looked at her the way people often looked at unaffiliated healers arriving alone, with a mixture of professional assessment and mild suspicion. She handed over the letter. They read it twice. They let her in. She was halfway across the courtyard when it happened. The wolves near the gate went still first, then the ones by the water trough, then the ones crossing toward the training ground, mid-step, mid-conversation, stopping as if something had pulled the sound from the air. A woman carrying firewood set it down without knowing why. 2 men who had been arguing fell quiet and turned. One of the young wolves near the stable wall, barely more than a pup, dropped to one knee without appearing to decide to do it. The bowing moved through the courtyard like a wave. Mira stopped walking. She had been in enough pack territories to know what bowing meant. She had never seen it directed at someone who wasn't a ranked wolf. She had never seen it directed at a healer with a canvas satchel and mud on her boots. She looked behind her, checking for whoever they were actually responding to. There was no one. She turned back. Every wolf in the courtyard was looking at her. She filed it away. She had work to do. She didn't see him until the 3rd encounter, and even then she almost missed it. He was standing on the upper walkway when she crossed the courtyard the 2nd time. Late afternoon, the light going amber and long. She wouldn't have noticed him at all except that he was entirely still in a way that made him stand out against the movement of the wolves below. Tall, broad through the shoulders. The kind of build that came from actual use rather than performance. His arms were resting on the stone railing, and he was watching the courtyard with the expression of a man who had learned to make his face say nothing. He was watching her. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds before she continued walking. She told herself it meant nothing. She had work to do. His name was Cael Dorn, and he was the alpha of Ironhold, and she learned both of these things from a junior healer named Petra, who told her with the breathless reverence of someone reporting on weather conditions. "He doesn't come to the healing ward," Petra said. "He sends his second. He doesn't—" She paused, searching for the right word. "He doesn't involve himself in things he can't control." Mira noted this, filed it, went back to the fever charts. He came to the healing ward that evening. She was alone, cataloging the guild's supply inventory against what the ward actually had, which was a task that required concentration and produced a list of shortages long enough to be its own kind of headache. She heard the door and said, without looking up, "If you're here about the Aldrich boy, his fever broke this afternoon. He'll need broth and rest for 2 more days. Nothing strenuous." "I know," he said. "Petra told me." She looked up then. He was bigger than she'd registered from the walkway, filling the doorway with the particular solidity of someone who had stopped being aware of how much space they occupied. His eyes were gray. Not the interesting kind of gray that people wrote poetry about, a flat, working gray, like stone that had been rained on for a long time. "Then what can I do for you?" she asked. The silence stretched for a moment that was too long and too short at the same time. "I wanted to see the healer who made my courtyard bow," he said. She set down her pen. "I didn't make anyone do anything." "No," he said, "you didn't." He said it the way he said everything, she would later learn, as if each word had been picked up and examined before being set down. "That's what I wanted to see." He left before she could formulate a response. She counted the supply bottles twice that night, which was a thing she did when she was unsettled. The next 4 days were a study in proximity. He didn't seek her out. He didn't avoid her either. He was simply present in the places she was, with the regularity of someone whose territory happened to include every room she entered. She found him in the great hall when she came for meals, always at the head of the long table, always with his second, a quiet man named Fen, at his left shoulder. She found him in the corridor outside the healing ward at odd hours, walking the perimeter of the fortress the way she imagined he always had, and she had no reason to believe he had changed his route. She found him in the courtyard at dawn when she went to check on a recovering wolf who preferred to sleep in the yard, and he was already there, standing at the edge of the training ground with a cup of something hot, watching the frost on the stone. He always noticed her. He never made it obvious. She noticed him noticing her, which was its own kind of problem. On the 5th evening, she was rebuilding the fire in the small hearth of the room they'd given her when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. They stopped outside her door. She waited, holding the poker, counting seconds the way she counted supply bottles. A nervous habit she'd had since childhood. She counted to 12. The footsteps didn't knock. They stayed for a moment that felt like a held breath, and then they moved on. She sat with that for a long time. She told herself she had imagined it. She hadn't. On the 6th day, he came to the healing ward again. This time she was expecting him, though she couldn't have said why. "The fever has moved to 2 more of the older wolves," she said, before he could speak. "I've adjusted the treatment. It's not the same strain. It's presenting differently. I need 3 more compounds from your stores if you have them, and if you don't, I'll need to send to Ashfield." "We have them," he said. "I'll have Fen bring them up." "Good." She went back to her notes. He didn't leave. She let the silence sit for a moment, then looked up. "Something else?" she asked. He was standing with his hands flat on the supply table, looking at the wall of shelves behind her with the expression of a man who had come in with something to say and was reconsidering it. "How long?" he said finally. "Have you been an unaffiliated healer?" 4 years. Before that, guild training, 6 years. And before that, she tilted her head. Before that, I was a child, which I assume you've also been at some point. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Close enough. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Ashfield." She paused. "Originally, Marin." The name of her hometown landed in the room, and she watched him process it. Marin was 3 territories north of Ironhold. It was also, she had discovered during her guild years, the territory where Cael Dorn had been born, before Ironhold had been his. "Small world," she said. "Yes," he said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "It is." He left. She counted the shelves. The council came on the 8th day. She didn't know there was a council session scheduled. She was in the middle of a treatment when Petra appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone delivering bad news carefully. "The Alpha's council is asking for you," Petra said. "The formal chamber. Now." Mira finished the treatment, washed her hands, and followed Petra down 2 flights of stone stairs to a room she hadn't been in yet. The council chamber was on the ground floor, low-ceilinged and torchlit, with a long table and 7 wolves arranged around it with the particular stillness of people who had been waiting long enough to be annoyed about it. At the head of the table sat a woman Mira didn't recognize, older, silver-haired, with the careful enunciation of someone who had learned that smooth voices were more frightening than loud ones. Cael was at the far end of the table. He was watching the door when she walked in. "Heir Voss," the silver-haired woman said. "Please sit." Mira sat. "I am Counselor Veth. We have some questions about the incident in the courtyard." "The bowing," Mira said. "Yes." Counselor Veth's voice was smooth and deliberate. "You understand that an unsolicited pack recognition response directed at an unaffiliated, unranked outsider is irregular." "I understand that," Mira said. "I didn't ask for it." "No, but it happened." The counselor folded her hands. "There are certain implications under pack law when a recognition event of that nature occurs. Implications that require clarity." Mira looked at her steadily. "What kind of clarity?" "The kind," Counselor Veth said, "that requires the Alpha to formally acknowledge or formally deny the nature of your presence here." The room was very quiet. Mira turned and looked at Cael. He was already looking at her. His expression was controlled, the flat, working gray of his eyes giving nothing away. But she had spent 8 days cataloging the small fractures in his composure, and she could see the jaw tightening. She could see the stillness that was not ease, but effort. "I came here to treat a fever," Mira said, returning her gaze to the counselor. "I have a contract with the Northern Guild. I'm not here under any other terms." "That may be," Counselor Veth said, "but the pack has responded to you in a way that suggests the bond has already begun." "Then the bond is the pack's business," Mira said, "not mine." "Under Ironhold law," the counselor said, with the precision of someone reading from a document they had memorized, "an unacknowledged bond that has triggered pack recognition must be formally addressed within 30 days, or the bond is considered abandoned by the Alpha. Abandoned bonds are dissolved by any means the Council deems necessary." The words landed in the room like stones in water. Mira looked at Cael again. He said, "That's enough, Veth." His voice was flat and final. The room shifted. "The healer is here under guild contract," he said. "She will complete her work. The council will not involve itself in her treatment schedule or her presence in this territory. Is that understood?" Counselor Veth held his gaze for exactly as long as she could afford to. "Of course, Alpha," she said. "We simply wanted clarity." "You have it," he said. After the council, Mira went back to the healing ward and counted every bottle on the shelf twice. Then she sat down and stared at the wall for a long time, thinking about the word abandoned and the word dissolved and the 30 days that had apparently already started. She went to find him that night. He was in the study on the 2nd floor, the one with the window that looked over the courtyard. She knocked. He said, "Come in," and she came in. And she closed the door behind her and stood in the middle of the room and looked at him across the desk. "Tell me what's happening," she said. He set down the papers he was holding. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this conversation and had not yet decided how to have it. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." A pause. "All right." "The council said 30 days, she said. "They said abandoned bonds get dissolved. What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "It means the council has the authority, under pack law, to sever an unacknowledged bond by force. It's a mechanism that exists to prevent political instability." He paused. "It's painful." "For who?" "Both," he said, "but more for the unbonded party." She absorbed this. And you're the alpha. You could stop them. Yes. But you haven't formally acknowledged the bond. The silence stretched. No, he said. She held his gaze. Why? He stood up then, moving away from the desk to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the courtyard below, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. The particular tension of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and was running out of the strength to keep holding it. I had a mate, he said, 6 years ago. She waited. Her name was Senna. She died. He said it the way he said everything, flat, final, no explanation offered, none needed. The bond severed when she died. That's... He stopped. That's not a thing that leaves you intact. No, Mira said quietly. I imagine it doesn't. I decided after that I would not name another bond, that I would run this pack and manage this territory and not... He turned back from the window. You? His eyes were quieter than she'd seen them. And then you walked through my gate, and my pack bowed before you'd taken 10 steps, and I have been standing at the edge of something I told myself I wouldn't do again for 8 days. The room was very still. You're afraid, she said. Yes. Of the bond. Of naming it, he said. Name things can be lost. I know what that costs. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the footsteps outside her door that hadn't knocked. She thought about the courtyard bowing. She thought about the 30 days and the council's smooth voice and the word dissolved. She thought about the test she had taken that morning, the one she'd almost dismissed as impossible, the one sitting in her satchel right now like a stone she hadn't figured out how to put down. I'm afraid too, she said. He looked at her. I'm afraid, she said, that you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for me to leave and miss the part where I don't. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the precise line of his jaw, the way his eyes had gone from flat gray to something much more careful. He raised one hand and she held still, and he set his palm against her cheek with the deliberateness of a man who had made a decision and was not going back on it. Stay, he said, not for the contract. Stay. She looked up at him. Ask me properly. Something crossed his face. Mira Voss, he said, will you let me name this? She held his gaze for a long moment. Yes, she said. She found out she was pregnant 3 hours later. She had gone back to her room to get the test she'd been avoiding all day. The one she'd taken on a quiet suspicion and then refused to look at because she had been in the middle of a council confrontation and a confession, and she hadn't had the space to process one more thing. She looked at it now, alone in her room with the fire burning low, and the result was not ambiguous. She sat with that for a very long time. And then, before she had finished sitting with it, there was a knock at her door. Not his knock. She knew his footsteps by now. This was Finn, the second, and his face when she opened the door told her something had happened before he said a word. The Alpha, Finn said carefully, has been called to the Great Hall. The council convened an emergency session. Councillor Veth has presented a formal challenge to the acknowledgement. She's brought an alliance offer from Greywood. Mira waited. Greywood's Alpha is offering a political bond, Fenn said, a formal mating arrangement. It would consolidate the Northern Territories. He paused. The council is calling it a matter of pack survival. And Cael? She asked. Fenn's expression did something complicated. He's in the hall. He asked me to... Another pause. He asked me to make sure you were informed. She closed the door. She stood in the middle of her room. She looked at the test in her hand, and then at the satchel, and then at the door. She made a decision in the time it took to breathe in and out once. She went to the great hall. The hall was full. Every ranked wolf in the fortress, it seemed, had been summoned or had come of their own accord, and they were arranged in the formal half-circle of a pack assembly, torches burning high. The stone floor carrying sound the way it always did in these old buildings. Every footstep, every breath. Cael was at the center. Counselor Veth was to his left. A man Mira didn't know? Tall, composed, the particular composure of someone who had never had to fight for a room's attention, stood at Veth's shoulder. The Greywood Alpha. Mira walked in. The room turned. Cael saw her first. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, something more careful than relief. Counselor Veth's voice cut across the room. "This is a closed assembly, Healer Voss." "I have something relevant to the proceedings," Mira said. "This is a matter of pack law and political alliance. You are not a party to—" "I am," Mira said, "if the bond in question has already progressed beyond acknowledgement." The room went very quiet. Veth's smooth voice sharpened. "What are you saying?" Mira looked at Cael. He was looking back at her with the particular expression of a man who was doing the math very quickly and had arrived at an answer that had stopped his breathing. "I'm saying," Mira said to the room, to the council, to Veth's careful face and the Greywood Alpha's composed one, that the Alpha of Ironhold is going to be a father, and that any political alliance that doesn't account for that fact is built on incomplete information. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Counselor Veth said, very carefully, "That is a significant claim." "Yes," Mira said, "it is." She looked at Cael. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. The control was still there, but underneath it was something that looked, in the torchlight, like a man who had been standing in cold water for 6 years and had just felt the temperature change. He crossed the floor to her. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment that was too long and too short at the same time. Then he turned to face the room, and she stood at his shoulder, and he said, in the flat, final voice that left no room for interpretation, "The bond is named. The healer is mine, and I am hers, before this pack and before whatever council wishes to challenge it. The Greywood offer is declined." The Greywood Alpha inclined his head with the grace of a man who had lost nothing he'd been certain of gaining. Counselor Veth said nothing. The pack, all of them, the ranked wolves and the guards and the woman who had set down her firewood in the courtyard 8 days ago, bowed. The ceremony was 3 days later, at dawn, with frost on the stone. It was not elaborate. Cael had asked her what she wanted, and she had said something real, and he had understood what she meant. They stood in the courtyard where the pack had first bowed to her, and Fenn served as witness, and the words were old words, the kind that pack law required to make a bond official and undeniable. She said her part. He said his. When he spoke the formal, claiming words, his voice was the same flat, deliberate cadence it always was, but she could hear the weight of it, the particular weight of someone saying something they had not permitted themselves to say for 6 years. When it was done, the pack bowed again. This time, she didn't look behind her. Afterward, in the quiet of the study with the window over the courtyard, they sat with 2 cups of something hot and the specific domestic piece of people who had survived something and come out the other side of it. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "When did you know about the bond?" She looked at him over her cup. "Honestly." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes had that quieter quality they got when he was being careful with something true. "Before you crossed the courtyard," he said, "when the gate opened." She stared at him. "That was the first moment I arrived." "Yes." "You knew immediately." "Yes." She held that. "And you still spent 8 days being afraid?" he said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment, then she set down her cup. That's the most inefficient use of 8 days I've ever heard of. Something crossed his face, the almost smile, the one she'd been cataloging since the first day. Except this time it didn't stop at almost. It arrived fully, and it changed the whole geometry of his face, and she filed it away in a different category than everything else she'd been filing. You're not wrong, he said. I'm a healer, she said. I'm never wrong about diagnoses. And what's the diagnosis? She considered. A man who spent 6 years being afraid to name anything, she said. Complicated by a woman who arrived and made the naming unavoidable. She paused. Prognosis is good. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Not gripping, just resting, the way you rest something you've been carrying for a long time, and have finally decided to put down carefully rather than drop. Good, he said. Outside, the frost was burning off the stone as the sun came up, and the courtyard below was filling with the ordinary sounds of a pack beginning its day. Footsteps, voices, the distant clang of the training ground. She could hear it all through the window, the whole living weight of a place that had bowed to her before she'd understood why, and was now simply home. She didn't count anything. She didn't need to. And that pack is where I'll leave them. A healer who walked into a fortress with a satchel and a contract, and walked out with a pack, a bond, and the particular satisfaction of having made a controlled man say true things in front of witnesses. A king who spent 6 years afraid to name anything, undone in 8 days by a woman who arrived without asking his permission. Here's what I want to know from you. When she walked into that great hall and said what she said in front of the entire pack, was that courage, or was that the most elegant power move you've ever seen? Because I think it might be both, and I think she knew exactly what she was doing. Tell me in the comments, did she handle it right? And if you were Cael, 8 days of knowing, 8 days of standing at the window watching her cross the courtyard, how long before you cracked? If this story found you tonight, share it with someone who needs a good love story. The kind where the bravest thing anyone does isn't fighting. It's naming something true in front of people who are watching. I'll see you at the next fire.